The shot broke the silence before anyone could blink. No warning, no warm-up, no introduction. Avery Carter chambered the next round before the echo finished rolling across the range, and every operator on that line froze. If you love stories about people who refuse to be underestimated, subscribe right now, hit that notification bell, and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Commander Ethan Walker had seen a lot of things in his 19 years running precision shooting evaluations for naval special warfare. He had seen decorated veterans break under pressure. He had seen operators with perfect records collapse the moment the conditions stopped cooperating. He had watched men who looked like soldiers on paper turn into something entirely different the moment the target stopped being stationary and the wind stopped being predictable. I thought he had seen everything. Then the file landed on his desk on a Tuesday morning, and he read the name at the top 3 times because he was certain he had misread it. Avery Carter, age 17. He set the file down, picked up his coffee, set the coffee down without drinking it, picked the file up again. 17 years old, no military service record, no combat deployment history, no years inside special operations units learning the kind of patience and controlled aggression that elite shooting required. The recommendations came from names he recognized only vaguely: a retired range instructor from Nevada, a competitive shooting coach from a regional program, a letter from someone who described themselves simply as a long-range hunting guide from Wyoming. Walker read every word twice. Then he called the training coordinator and asked flatly who had approved this. "The evaluations are open to qualified candidates, sir. Her scores met the threshold." "Her scores," Walker repeated. "Every benchmark, clean across the board." Walker closed the file. He had a policy about forming opinions before he saw someone perform. He believed the policy was good, believed it was fair, believed it was the kind of professional discipline that separated serious instructors from the ones who let impressions do their thinking for them. He broke the policy the moment Avery Carter walked through the door on evaluation morning. She was not what the room expected. The other candidates that day were what the program typically attracted: experienced men with the kind of physical bearing and quiet confidence that came from years of doing the kind of work that didn't get discussed at dinner tables. They moved through the check-in process with the easy familiarity of people who had been in rooms like this before. They greeted each other with the shorthand of shared experience. They assessed the equipment with the calm eyes of people who already knew what they were looking for. Avery stood near the entry, carrying a rifle case that looked older than most of the candidates' service records. She was not small exactly, but she was young in a way that the room felt immediately not in her posture, which was straight and still in a way that Walker noticed without meaning to, but in the details. The way a few of the veterans' eyes moved toward her and then away. The way the check-in officer paused almost imperceptibly before continuing with her paperwork. The way 2 operators near the equipment rack exchanged a look that Walker had seen many times before, in many different forms. It said without words, "What is she doing here?" Walker said nothing. He watched. Avery completed her check-in without looking around the room for reassurance. She moved to the designated waiting area, set her case down carefully, and began reviewing something in a small notebook she pulled from her jacket pocket. She did not look up to see who was watching her. She did not appear to be performing calm. She appeared to actually be calm, which was different, and Walker, who had spent nearly 2 decades learning the difference, registered it without yet knowing what to do with the information. Master Chief Ryan Mitchell appeared at Walker's shoulder without announcement. Mitchell was 41 years old, had 11 deployments, and a reputation that preceded him into rooms before he arrived in them. He was not arrogant in the way that small people were arrogant. He was confident in the way that people who had earned every inch of their standing were confident, which sometimes looked identical to arrogance from the outside, and was genuinely difficult to distinguish from it even up close. "That the Carter file?" Mitchell asked. "You read it. Coordinator mentioned it. 17. 17, Walker confirmed. Mitchell looked across the room at her. Avery had not moved, still reading the notebook, still not looking up. "Recommendations any good?" "Unusual," Walker said. "Meaning what?" meaning I couldn't verify most of the context. Her coach runs a small regional program. The range instructor she trained under is retired, no current affiliation. The hunting guide who wrote the third letter. Walker paused. Described her as the most naturally patient shooter he'd encountered in 30 years of guiding. Patience doesn't translate to operational precision. No, Walker agreed. It doesn't. They both watched her for another moment. She's going to have a hard few days, Mitchell said. Everyone has a hard few days. Some harder than others. Walker didn't respond to that because Mitchell wasn't wrong, and they both knew it. The evaluation program was not designed to be comfortable. It was designed to find the point at which a shooter stopped performing correctly, to locate the ceiling, to identify the cracks, to determine whether what looked like skill was skill, or whether it was something that would fracture under the kind of sustained compounding pressure that real operational scenarios created. Avery Carter was about to find out what that pressure felt like, and Walker, despite himself, was curious what she would do when she found it. The first assessment began at 0700. Standard protocols, known distances, conditions. Walker's team had evaluated hundreds of times. The purpose of the opening phase was not to challenge it, was to baseline, to understand where a candidate started before the real work began. Avery moved to her assigned lane without ceremony. The operators around her ran through familiar pre-fire routines with the automatic competence of people who had performed them so many times, the actions had become unconscious. Checking, adjusting, settling into position with the practiced ease of long repetition. Avery did something different. She didn't immediately move into position. She stood behind the firing line for almost 90 seconds, completely still, looking at Walker. Walker couldn't immediately tell. She appeared to be looking at the range itself. Not the targets, not the equipment. The range. One of the other candidates, a man named Bressler, who had 8 years in special operations, and the kind of easy social authority that came with that, noticed. "First time on a formal range?" he asked. Not maliciously, almost helpfully. Avery looked at him. Something in her expression that wasn't offense, and wasn't amusement, and wasn't the carefully neutral blankness of someone trying not to react. It was something that Walker, watching from the instructor position, thought looked like patience. Genuine, unperformed patience. "No," she said simply. Then she turned back and kept looking at the range. Bressler exchanged a glance with the man beside him, shrugged, moved into position. Walker walked toward her, not aggressively, conversationally, the way he moved toward any candidate when he wanted to understand what they were doing before making a judgment about it. "Carter." She turned. "Something specific you're looking at." "Wind flag on the left side," she said. "It's moving different from the right flag." Walker looked. She was correct. The two flags at opposite ends of the range were showing slightly different movement, a variance in crosswind that was small enough that most shooters would normalize it as general ambient wind condition and account for it with a standard hold. "You've been watching it for how long?" "Since I came in." "And what are you seeing?" "It's not consistent. It shifts every 30 to 40 seconds. There's a pattern, but it's not regular. I want to understand the interval before I start." Walker looked at the flags again. He had been running evaluations on this range for 11 years. He had not noticed the specific interval pattern she was describing. He was not sure she was right about it. He was also not sure she was wrong. "Take your position, Carter. Assessment starts in 3 minutes." She nodded, moved into position. No argument. Walker returned to the instructor line and picked up his data tablet without looking at the range. Around him, the other senior instructors were already marking baseline notes, running their standard observation protocols. "Kids stalling?" one of them asked quietly. "No," Walker said. He wasn't sure of much about Avery Carter yet, but he was sure of that. The first scores came back 90 minutes later. Walker looked at the numbers and then looked at them again. Not because they were extraordinary. They were very good, clean, consistent, technically correct in ways that suggested genuine training and genuine aptitude. But the numbers themselves weren't what stopped him. What stopped him was the distribution. Every shot in the assessment showed the same margin of variance. Not similar. The same. Like the rounds had been placed by someone who understood the relationship between each shot, not as isolated events, but as a sequence. As a conversation with the target at a particular distance, under particular conditions. Walker had seen shooters with better raw numbers. He had rarely seen that kind of distribution consistency at first assessment. He flagged it and said nothing. During the break between phases, Avery sat apart from the main group. Not because she was excluded, the other candidates weren't hostile exactly. Not yet. But because she had her notebook out again and was writing in it, and she seemed genuinely absorbed in whatever she was writing. Mitchell watched this from across the staging area and came to Walker's position for the second time that morning. "She's journaling," Mitchell said. "On an evaluation day." "Looks like it. That's either very confident or very naive." "Or it's neither," Walker said. Mitchell looked at him. Meaning I don't know yet." Walker set down his tablet. What did Reyes say about her initial position work? Instructor Reyes had been watching mechanical fundamentals. Mitchell relayed what Reyes had flagged, that Avery's position setup was unconventional in several ways. Not wrong, not inefficient, but different from standard instruction in ways that suggested she hadn't learned from standard instruction. "Who trained her?" Mitchell asked. "Her father primarily," Walker said. "According to the file. Father's military. No record of it. So she learned long-range precision from a civilian, apparently." Mitchell processed this. His expression shifted not dramatically, but enough that Walker noticed. The slight recalibration that happened when information didn't fit the category you'd placed it in. "That shouldn't work," Mitchell said. "Not at this level." "No," Walker agreed. "It shouldn't." Neither of them said anything else for a moment. Then Walker picked his tablet back up and moved toward the range for the next assessment phase, and Mitchell followed, and neither of them said the thing they were both thinking. That sometimes the fact that something shouldn't work was exactly the problem with how you'd been thinking about it. The second assessment phase introduced variables. Moving targets. Shifting wind conditions generated by the range's environmental control systems. Communication requirements, layered on top of shooting requirements. Candidates had to verbalize their read conditions and call their shots before firing, creating a record that the instructors could evaluate alongside the actual results. This was where candidates who had real skill but imperfect fundamentals started to show the gaps. Bressler's communication was good, but his adjustments lagged. Another candidate named Torres, who had shown excellent static performance, began rushing his reads when the target movement introduced time pressure. Avery did not rush. She called her conditions quietly, but clearly. Wind direction, estimated speed, anticipated variance. Range estimate. Angle. She called them in the same order every time with the same calm cadence. Like someone reading from a checklist they'd internalized so completely it no longer felt like a checklist. Walker moved position so he could hear her calls directly. Third moving target sequence. Conditions had shifted from the setup. Wind left to right, 8 to 10 gusting to 12, she said. Estimated target speed 4. Range 470. Call right of center, hold for gust. She fired. The spotter confirmed center of mass. Walker marked his notes without expression. Fourth sequence. The environmental system pushed a sudden crosswind variation that caught most of the candidates in mid-adjustment. 3 shooters pulled their shots. 2 paused and reset. Torres attempted to compensate in real time and overcorrected. Avery had already adjusted her call before the wind fully shifted. Walker stared at his notes for a moment. Then he walked to Reyes's position. "Did she anticipate that gust?" he asked quietly. Reyes pulled up his data. Her adjustment preceded the full shift by about 2 seconds. She read it before it completed. "That's what the timing shows." Walker looked down the range. Avery was resetting for the next sequence, working through her routine without apparent awareness that Walker and Reyes were discussing her. "That's not technical skill," Reyes said carefully. "No," Walker said. "It's not." He didn't explain further because there wasn't much to explain. Technical skill was what the program taught. Technical skill was what the evaluations measured. What Walker was watching was something different. Something the program had never found a reliable way to teach. After the second phase, Walker called a general briefing for all candidates. Standard procedure review of performance identification of areas for focus framework for the following day's requirements. He went through the standard points efficiently reading from the objective performance record without editorializing. Then he paused at one data point. During the variable crosswind sequence, one candidate called the adjustment 2 seconds ahead of the full wind shift. He didn't name her. He didn't need to. Every candidate in the room knew who he was talking about. I want to discuss how that's possible. Silence. Then Bressler. Lucky read. Possibly, Walker said. What else? Environmental pattern recognition, another candidate offered. If you've seen enough range conditions, you start reading the setup before the event. That's part of it. What else? Avery spoke from the back of the room. Not loudly, not assertively. The way someone speaks when they have an answer and aren't performing the having of it. The wind didn't just shift, it compressed first. Every head turned. Before a full directional shift on an open range, there's usually a compression pattern. The air pressure builds slightly in the incoming direction. It's small, but it's there if you're watching for it. A beat of silence. Where did you learn that? Walker asked. My father taught me. He said the wind tells you what it's going to do before it does it. You just have to be listening to the right things. The room was quiet. Mitchell, standing at the side wall, had his arms crossed and his expression carefully neutral. But Walker knew Mitchell's neutral face well enough to read what was underneath it. It was the look of a man revising a number upward and not entirely comfortable with how far upward. Walker turned back to the room and continued the briefing. But something had shifted. Not dramatically, not in any way that would appear in his official notes. But something in the air of that room had changed, and everyone in it felt it, even the ones who wouldn't have been able to name what exactly had moved. That evening, Walker read Avery's file again. He read it more carefully this time, the way he should have read it the first time, not looking for what was missing, but following what was actually there. The father's name was Robert Carter. There was a brief biographical note: former competitive shooter, regional and national level, retired from competition due to health. He had coached Avery from early childhood, apparently designing a training program for her that pulled from competitive long-range shooting, hunting conditions work, and environmental reading techniques he had developed over decades. He had died 14 months before the evaluation. Walker read that line twice. Then he turned to the letter from the hunting guide in Wyoming. He had skimmed it on first read. Now he read the whole thing. The guide man, named Hollis, 31 years of backcountry hunting and mountain terrain, wrote that he had worked with Avery on 3 occasions when she was 14 and 15. He said he had guided professional hunters, competitive shooters, military veterans. He said he had never seen anyone at any level read wind and atmospheric conditions the way Robert Carter's daughter read them. He wrote one sentence that Walker underlined without deciding to. She doesn't calculate the shot. She waits until she understands what it wants to be, and then she lets it be that. Walker sat with that sentence for a long time. It was an unusual thing to write about a shooter. It was the kind of description that would sound like romantic nonsense from most sources, from a man who had spent 30 years in environments where an imprecise read didn't lose you a competition score, but cost you the animal you'd tracked for a week. Walker thought it sounded like the most precise description he had encountered in the entire file. He closed the folder. Tomorrow was going to be more complicated than today. He was not yet sure whether complicated was a problem. Day 2 began with a scenario Walker had used many times. A simulated operational environment, not a range in the traditional sense. A sequence of decision points requiring the candidate to evaluate not just where and when to shoot, but whether to shoot and in what order and with what communication to a simulated team element. It was the assessment that weeded out candidates who could shoot perfectly in isolation and fell apart the moment shooting was embedded in a larger operational picture. It was also the assessment that Mitchell had specifically requested Walker include after reading the file. If she's as good as the numbers suggest, Mitchell had said, this is where we find out whether she's good or whether she's ready. Walker had agreed. He had not mentioned that the distinction Mitchell was drawing was one he was no longer entirely certain mapped onto Avery Carter the way it mapped onto other candidates. The scenario launched at 7:30. 4 candidates rotated through. Bressler performed well, solid communication, good decision, architecture shot, selection, consistent with the scenario parameters. Torres struggled with the communication layer, which confirmed what the variable phase had suggested. 2 others performed adequately. Then Avery. She entered the scenario environment and paused. Not in the hesitant way. In the observational way Walker had already come to recognize. She spent 40 seconds looking at the layout before she moved. The range observer Petty Officer Daniels, who had been running scenario setups for 6 years, glanced at Walker. Walker made a small motion with his hand. Wait. Avery moved. She didn't move to the first decision point. She moved to a position offset from the primary line where she spent 15 seconds observing a secondary element of the scenario setup. Then she moved to the primary point and began the sequence. Her shot selection was accurate. Her timing was precise. Her communication calls to the simulated team element were clear and correctly formatted. But what Walker watched most carefully was her sequencing. At the third decision point, the scenario presented a standard choice. Engage the primary target or hold for a secondary target that would appear on a known timing interval. Standard evaluation. Most candidates took the primary because the secondary was uncertain. Avery held. She waited through the timing interval. The secondary target appeared, but not where the scenario had placed it in previous runs. Walker had modified it that morning, a small adjustment to test whether candidates were running the scenario from memory or from actual real-time read. Avery had never seen the previous version. She was running entirely from real-time read. She adjusted her position in 2 seconds, called the new angle fired. Hit. Walker stood behind the observation point for a long moment without moving. Daniels appeared at his shoulder. That was the modified secondary position. I know. She couldn't have known it was modified. She didn't need to know it was modified, Walker said. She wasn't shooting at where the scenario said it would be. She was shooting at where it actually was. Daniels processed this. Most of them run it from the brief. I know. She ran it from the situation. Yes. Walker made his notes in silence. Behind him, he was aware that Mitchell had been standing against the back wall for the last 4 minutes. I was aware that Mitchell had not said anything. For Mitchell, who always had something to say, that silence meant something. The day ended with an informal session, candidates' instructors' standard end-of-day discussion of performance and focus areas. Mitchell took a position near Walker and watched the candidates talk among themselves during the break before the session started. Avery was talking with Bressler. Walker was too far to hear, but Bressler's body language had shifted dramatically from the morning's slight condescension. He was leaning in, asking questions, nodding at the answers. She's explaining something to him, Mitchell said. Looks like it. What happened in the scenario? She read a modified position in real time. No prior data. Correct. That's not something you teach. Walker looked at him. No, it's not. So how does a 17-year-old who's never been in a tactical environment have that kind of read integration? I think, Walker said carefully, that she's been in more difficult environments than we're accounting for. We keep looking at the absence of military background as a gap. I'm starting to think that's the wrong way to look at it. Mitchell frowned. What's the right way to look at it? Her father trained her for conditions, real conditions. Mountain terrain, variable wind, uncertain target positions. She's not running our scenarios. She's running the scenarios she built with him for years. Walker paused. The difference is that ours are actually less complex than what she's used to. Mitchell was quiet for a moment. If that's true, he said slowly, then we've been evaluating her performance against a lower standard than what she's already operating at. That's what I'm starting to believe. Another silence. Then Mitchell said something Walker didn't expect. "I owe her a better evaluation than I've been giving her." Walker looked at him. Mitchell's expression was the expression of a man who had realized something uncomfortable and was choosing not to look away from it. "I didn't read her file without bias," Mitchell said. "I read her file looking for the reasons the disqualification would show up." Walker said nothing. "That's not how I was trained to evaluate. That's how I was trained not to evaluate." Mitchell uncrossed his arms. "I'll adjust tomorrow." Walker nodded once. He did not say what he was thinking, that Mitchell's willingness to say that out loud in the middle of an ongoing evaluation was itself the kind of character quality that the program looked for and rarely found this cleanly. He just nodded. And the day ended. And tomorrow was already going to be something different from today. That night in the bunk room, Avery opened her notebook. She wrote about the scenarios. She wrote about what she had read in the wind that day, what she had seen in the flag intervals, what the secondary target's adjusted position had told her about how the instructors thought about the evaluation structure. She wrote about Bressler's questions during the break. He had asked her without armor how she had read the wind compression, and she had told him what her father had taught her, and he had listened with the focused intensity of a professional encountering a concept he hadn't encountered before. That had felt like something. She wrote about the range at dusk when the light changed and the environmental reads shifted and the targets became shadows. She wrote about her father. She didn't write about missing him exactly. She wrote about a conversation they had when she was 12 on a Wyoming hillside with wind coming in from the northwest and a target at 600 meters. And he had said she remembered his voice exactly. "The shot is the last decision you make. The first decision is understanding what the world is telling you." She had asked him what he meant. He had said, "Most shooters think they're in a conversation with the target. But you're not in a conversation with the target. You're in a conversation with everything between you and the target. The target is just where the conversation ends." She had not fully understood it then. She understood it now. She closed the notebook. The bunk room was quiet. The evaluation was 2 days old. 3 more days remained before the final assessment. She did not know yet what Walker was planning. She did not know yet that Mitchell had said what he said. She did not know the full shape of what was coming. She knew only what her father had taught her, that you did not need to know everything that was coming. You needed to be present for everything that arrived. She turned off the light, and in the dark, she listened to the wind outside the building, the same wind that would be running across that range tomorrow morning. And she began reading it already, the way he had taught her, the way she would never stop doing. The way that was not a skill anymore, but was simply, completely, entirely who she was. Day 3 started with a problem nobody had planned for. Walker arrived at the range at 0615 to find Mitchell already there, standing at the long-range firing line, with a ballistic data sheet in one hand and Avery's performance file in the other. Mitchell was not a man who showed up early to read paperwork. Mitchell showed up early to shoot, to think, or to argue. Reading paperwork at 0615 meant something had gotten under his skin overnight and hadn't let go by morning. Walker walked to him without hurrying. "You've been here since when?" 5:30. Mitchell didn't look up from the file. "I pulled her environmental call logs from yesterday, all 3 phases." "And?" Mitchell finally looked up. His jaw was tight in the way it got when he was working against something he didn't want to be working against. "Her compression read before the crosswind shift. I ran it against the range's atmospheric sensors." Walker waited. She called it 2.4 seconds before the sensors registered the pressure change. Mitchell set the file down. "Our sensors are calibrated to military precision standards." She beat the sensors by 2 seconds. The wind moved across the range, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "I don't know how to account for that," Mitchell said. "I don't either," Walker said honestly. "She's 17. I know. I have operators with 12 years of precision work who can't read a compression pattern in real time. They compensate for it. They build the anticipation into their hold. It's a technical workaround." Mitchell looked back at the firing line. "She's not compensating, she's reading it live." Walker had already known this. but hearing Mitchell say it out loud. Mitchell, who had resisted the conclusion for 2 days, who had come into this evaluation with every reasonable professional reason to be skeptical, made it land differently. "What do you want to do with that information?" Walker asked. "I want to understand how it's possible," Mitchell said. "And then I want to make sure I'm giving her an evaluation that's actually testing her ceiling, not just confirming she can clear our standard floor." Walker nodded. "I've been running her through the same framework I run everyone through," Mitchell said. "That framework was designed for candidates with military backgrounds. Candidates who've built their skill inside institutional structures." He paused. "She didn't build her skill inside any structure. She built it in conditions. Real conditions. Mountain terrain, variable elevation, unpredictable wind patterns, game animals that don't hold position and don't care about your timing." Mitchell crossed his arms, then uncrossed them, a small restlessness that Walker recognized as the physical signal that Mitchell's thinking was still moving. "She spent years shooting in situations where the variables weren't controlled, and we've been evaluating her on a controlled range and calling it a challenge." The candidates began arriving at 0700. Avery was not the first through the gate, but she was among the first, and she did what she always did: move to a position where she could observe the range setup before taking her assigned station. Walker watched her from the instructor platform and said nothing. Bressler arrived a minute later, spotted Avery, and crossed directly to her. The two of them talked for several minutes before the formal session opened. Walker couldn't hear it from the platform, but he could see Bressler's posture forward, engaged, asking questions. Avery's posture still attentive, answering with what looked like care rather than performance. Instructor Reyes appeared at Walker's left. "Bressler's been following her around since last night. I noticed. He asked me this morning whether her wind red technique was something the program had considered incorporating into the standard curriculum." Reyes let that sit. Bressler has never asked about curriculum modification in 6 years of evaluations. Walker said nothing. "She's changing the conversation," Reyes said, "and she doesn't seem to know she's doing it." "She knows," Walker said. He wasn't sure how he was sure, but he was. "She just doesn't think of it as her responsibility to manage." The morning's first evolution was a communication and coordination exercise. 2-person teams. 1 shooter, 1 spotter. The spotter called conditions, the shooter fired. The evaluation was split: shooting performance and communication quality, assessed separately, then cross-referenced to determine how well each candidate integrated external data in real time versus relying on their own read. The pairings were assigned. Walker put Avery with Mitchell. He did this deliberately, not as a test of Avery, as a test of Mitchell. He wanted to see what happened when the program's most resistant voice was required to operate in direct coordination with her. Mitchell received the pairing without visible reaction. He looked at the assignment sheet, looked at Walker, and then walked to his assigned position without comment. Avery received the pairing, the same way she received everything, with a nod and a brief pause that Walker had come to understand was her processing the information before she moved. They set up side by side. The first sequence began. Mitchell's spotter calls were precise and efficient in the way of someone who had been calling conditions for over a decade. Clean, formatted, technically accurate. Standard military cadence. Avery listened, adjusted, fired. Hit. Second sequence. Mitchell called a wind adjustment that was correct by standard calculation. Avery held instead of adjusting. Mitchell noticed immediately. Carter. Adjustment called. "Wind cycling," she said quietly. "If I adjust now, it'll be back before I fire." A pause. Then, "Confidence on that?" 70%. Mitchell was quiet for 2 seconds. In spotter-shooter communication, 2 seconds is a long time. "Shooter's call," he said. She didn't adjust. She waited. The wind cycled back. She fired. Hit. Mitchell said nothing. Third sequence. More complex. The target moved through 3 position changes on a random interval, requiring the spotter to track and call each transition while the shooter managed position without losing the read thread. Mitchell tracked the first transition cleanly, called the second. The third came earlier than the random generator's average interval, an outlier timing that most spotter-shooter pairs experienced as a lag, a beat of disorganization while they recalibrated. Avery had already adjusted before Mitchell called the third position. She had tracked it herself simultaneously with his spotting. She fired at the exact moment Mitchell completed his call. Hit. Mitchell put down the binoculars. How was quiet for a moment that Walker, watching from the platform, recognized as significant. Mitchell was a man who filled silence with assessment. When he went quiet, it meant the assessment was requiring more processing than the silence could hold. "You were tracking all three positions independently," Mitchell said. It wasn't entirely a question. "I try not to be dependent on a single input source," Avery said. "No offense." "None taken." Mitchell picked the binoculars back up. "Your father teach you that. He said data should confirm what you're already reading, not replace it." Mitchell was quiet again. Then, "My first sniper instructor said something similar, 20 years ago." He adjusted the binoculars. "I'd forgotten it." The sequence reset. They moved into the next evolution without further comment. But Walker, watching from above, marked what had just happened with the kind of careful internal notation he reserved for moments that would matter later. Something had shifted in that exchange. Not dramatically, not with announcement. But Mitchell had stopped evaluating Avery and started listening to her. That was not a small thing. The mid-morning break produced a moment Walker hadn't expected. 3 candidates were clustered near the equipment staging area. Bressler, a man named Okafor, who'd been quietly strong through every phase, and a third candidate named Price, who had military police background and exceptional communication skills, but was still finding his rhythm on the long-range precision elements. Price was describing a problem he'd been having with his elevation holds in the variable crosswind sequences. Bressler was listening. Okafor was nodding in a way that said he'd had the same problem and hadn't solved it. Avery walked by. Price looked at her. Something in his expression, not hostile, not entirely comfortable, either the expression of a man who had revised an opinion once and was now deciding whether to revise it again. "Hey," he said. She stopped. "The elevation compensation issue, in the variable sequences." He paused. "You don't seem to have it. What are you doing differently?" She looked at him for a moment. Then she turned and looked at Bressler and Okafor, checking whether the question included them. Bressler said, "Yeah, please." She set her case down. For the next 12 minutes, she walked through her approach to multivariable compensation, not from a textbook framework, not from institutional doctrine, but from the framework her father had built for her, which started with the premise that every variable was part of a system, and the system had a logic that could be read if you looked at it long enough before you needed to act on it. She used no jargon. She used the language she had grown up with, the language of wind and terrain, and the patience of waiting for the moment the system revealed itself. Bressler asked 2 questions. Okafor asked 1. Price asked 3. Walker stood 20 feet away and watched the whole thing. Reyes came to stand beside him without being called. "She's teaching them," Reyes said. "Yes." "Do they know they're being taught?" Walker thought about it. "Price does. Bressler's starting to. Okafor's going to realize it in about an hour when he's on the line, and something she said clicks." Reyes was quiet. Then, "She's 17. I'm aware. And she's in the middle of her own evaluation, and she's spending her break helping 3 veterans improve their performance." "Yes." "Because someone asked her," Reyes said. "Not to impress anyone, because Price asked." Walker watched her. She had moved to a point where she was demonstrating something with her hands, showing the arc of a wind shift or the angle of a compensation hold. He couldn't tell from this distance. Bressler was leaning in. Price had his notebook out. "Her father raised someone remarkable," Walker said. It was not the kind of thing he usually said during evaluations. He said it anyway. Reyes nodded once and walked back to the platform. The afternoon brought the evolution. Mitchell had been waiting to see fail. Not because he wanted it to fail now. His position had moved. But the evolution was the one that had broken the most candidates across the years. Walker had been running it, and Mitchell had seen enough to believe that what broke under this particular pressure revealed more about a shooter than what succeeded under every other pressure. It was called the conversation exercise internally, not officially, but the name had stuck because it was what it felt like. A sequence of targets at variable distance, variable timing, under conditions that changed every 60 seconds without announcement. No pattern to predict, no interval to map, just the range doing what it wanted to do and the shooter responding. It lasted 40 minutes. It was designed to find the point at which a shooter's technical system broke down under sustained unpredictability. The candidates who handled it best were not the ones who had the most sophisticated technical systems. They were the ones who could abandon their system when the system stopped serving them and operate from something more fundamental. Most candidates identified that point at around the 25-minute mark. A few made it to 30. The evaluation record was 34 minutes before the data showed degradation. Avery ran the full 40 minutes. Walker didn't say anything when the clock stopped. He looked at the data. He looked at the target record. He looked at the consistency markers that his evaluation system tracked across the full sequence. Then he put his tablet face down on the table. Reyes was watching him. Walker. I see it. The last 10 minutes. I see it. She wasn't degrading, she was improving. Walker picked the tablet back up. Yes? That's not possible, Reyes said. Statistically, after 30 minutes of sustained variable pressure, performance degrades. That's not an opinion, it's physiological. Cognitive load compounds. Decision fatigue. I know the research, Walker said. So how? She wasn't fighting the unpredictability. Walker looked up from the tablet. She stopped trying to predict. Somewhere around the 20-minute mark. You can see it in the shot timing. She slowed down. Not in hesitation. In relaxation. He set the tablet down again. She was running out of system, and instead of pushing harder on the system, she let it go and just responded. Reyes stared at him. She stopped managing the range, Walker said, and started listening to it. The phrase from the Wyoming guide's letter moved through his memory. She doesn't calculate the shot. She waits until she understands what it wants to be, and then she lets it be that. Walker had underlined that sentence. Now he understood what Hollis had been trying to put into words. Mitchell approached Avery after the conversation exercise ended. Walker watched from across the staging area, not close enough to hear, but watching the body language, with the attention he gave things that mattered. Mitchell spoke first. Avery listened with the full stillness that Walker had come to understand was her version of respect. She didn't perform attentiveness. She simply became entirely attentive, and it showed. Then she said something. Then Mitchell said something. Then she said something longer, and Mitchell nodded, and then Mitchell said something that made Avery's expression change in a way Walker hadn't seen before. Not surprise exactly. Something softer than surprise. The expression of someone receiving something unexpected that they hadn't known they needed. Walker later asked Mitchell what had been said. Mitchell was quiet for a moment before answering. I told her that what I saw in the conversation sequence wasn't something the program had ever been able to teach, and I asked her how she'd learned it. What did she say? She said her father told her that when you run out of knowledge, you have two choices. You can panic and keep trying to use knowledge you don't have, or you can stop and remember that the situation is real, and your response to it can be real too, even when your preparation isn't enough. Mitchell paused. She said he called it operating from truth instead of operating from training. Walker considered this. And what did you say to that? I told her that was the best description of decision-making under extreme operational pressure I'd heard in 20 years. Mitchell looked at him. And then I apologized. Walker waited. I told her I had come into this evaluation with a conclusion already written, and that the conclusion was wrong, and that she deserved better than that from this program. Mitchell's jaw worked. She said she understood. She said she'd been underestimated before. How did that feel? Walker asked. Like being told something true by someone young enough to be my daughter. Mitchell held the eye contact steadily. Not comfortable, but true. Walker nodded. She didn't make me feel small, Mitchell added. That was the thing I didn't expect. She accepted the apology without using it, like it wasn't about her winning anything. It wasn't, Walker said. I know that now. Mitchell looked back toward where Avery was repacking her gear. I didn't know that 3 days ago. The fourth day introduced a component that Walker had not advertised in the pre-evaluation brief. A team element. 3 candidates would operate as a coordinated unit. 2 shooters, 1 spotter and coordinator, through a scenario that required simultaneous long-range precision and real-time communication with the coordinator, managing information flow between the 2 shooters while maintaining their own read of the environmental conditions. The coordinator role was the hardest. It required the ability to hold 3 separate threads simultaneously. Your own environmental read. Read the communication from Shooter 1, the communication from Shooter 2, and weave them into a coherent operational picture without losing any thread and without introducing lag. Walker assigned Avery as coordinator, not because she was the best shooter. Several candidates had comparable or superior numbers in isolated technical performance. He assigned her as coordinator because he had been watching her hold multiple information threads simultaneously since day 1, and he wanted to see what happened when she did it under the pressure of operational consequence. The scenario began. Bressler was Shooter 1. Okafor was Shooter 2. Avery was the coordinator. The first sequence ran cleanly. Standard conditions, manageable communication load. All 3 performed correctly. Then Walker's team introduced the first complication. A simulated communication disruption. Shooter 2's channel dropped for 40 seconds. Standard test of whether the coordinator could manage asymmetric information and maintain both operational threads simultaneously. Most coordinators fell back to Shooter 1 during the gap, focused on the available data, and accepted the degraded picture. Avery called a hold on Shooter 1's sequence, redirected her read to cover Okafor's position directly, and managed his thread manually through the disruption without losing Shooter 1's environmental data. When the channel restored, she was already calling Okafor back into sequence. No gap, no lag, no loss of thread on either side. Reyes leaned toward Walker. She held both lines. Yes. During the channel drop, she didn't choose between them. No. How? She's been doing that since she walked on this range, Walker said. Managing multiple reads simultaneously. We were watching her do it with the environment. She just did it with people. The scenario escalated. Second complication, a scenario-injected target priority change that required the coordinator to redirect both shooters simultaneously to new positions while maintaining the environmental read that governed their holds. Standard operating time for that evolution. 12 to 18 seconds of adjustment before the new sequence was running cleanly. Avery managed it in 7. Bressler afterward. She was already calling my new position before the scenario update finished transmitting. Okafor. I heard my redirect at the same time Bressler heard his. She split the call. Reyes turned to Walker. That's not in the evaluation parameters. No, it's not. She invented a more efficient protocol in real time. Walker said nothing for a moment. Then, write it up. Write it up for what purpose? Walker picked up his tablet. Because if a 17-year-old can develop a more efficient coordination protocol under scenario pressure on her 4th evaluation day, I want a written record of exactly how she did it, so we can understand whether it's replicable. He started walking toward the scenario debrief position. And because I want the evaluation record to be accurate. The debrief that evening was different from the previous ones. Something in the room had moved over 4 days, not all at once. Not with dramatic announcement, but the way rooms move when multiple people independently revise their understanding and find themselves without coordination arriving at the same new place. Walker ran through the objective performance data. Standard. Then he stopped following the standard format. I want to open the floor, he said. Anyone who has something substantive to say about today's team evolution. A pause. Then Bressler spoke. The coordinator protocol she ran during the priority redirect. I want to understand it better. I've been in a dozen operational coordination exercises, and I've never experienced that call split timing. It's not a protocol, Avery said from her position at the back of the room. Her voice was even not defensive. It's just when two things need to happen simultaneously, treating them sequentially creates lag, so you don't treat them sequentially. That's easier to say than to do, Price said. Yes, she agreed. It takes practice with the specific communication load you're managing. I've been doing something similar with environmental variables for years. She paused. I just applied the same principle to the communication layer. You transferred a skill from one domain to another in real time, Okafor said slowly. During an active scenario. That's one way to put it. Okafor looked at Walker. Is that something the program has documented, that kind of cross-domain skill transfer under pressure? Walker met the question directly. Not in the form we observed today. The room processed that. Price said, so she brought something into this evaluation that wasn't in the evaluation. Yes, Walker said. And we almost didn't see it. The room was very quiet. Walker let it be quiet. Because the thing. Price was saying the almost was the thing that mattered most in that moment. They had almost not seen it. They had almost evaluated her against the standard framework and missed everything that didn't fit the framework and sent her home with scores that reflected the framework and not the person. They had almost done that. Mitchell spoke from the side wall. In my experience, he said, the most dangerous thing about a fixed evaluation standard is not that it misses bad candidates. He paused. It's that it misses candidates who are operating above the ceiling the standard was designed to detect. The room looked at him. He looked at Avery. We designed this evaluation for a specific range of performance. You're outside that range. He said it without apology and without theater. Not below it. Avery held his gaze. I know, she said. Quiet, not boastful, just honest. Your father built that in you. Something moved across her face. Fast, and then gone. But Walker saw it, the brief flicker of something private and enormous, held for 1 second in the open before she brought it back. He tried to, she said. He succeeded, Mitchell said. The room was silent. Outside, the wind was still moving across the range, the way it had moved every evening. The same range, the same air, the same physics. But something about the way the people inside that building were listening to it had changed. Not the wind. Them. Walker closed his notes. Tomorrow is the final preparation day before the culminating assessment, he said. Get rest. Eat well. Think about nothing you can't control. He looked around the room. Then briefly he looked at Avery. You've all shown me things this week that I didn't expect. He meant it about all of them. But he meant it most about her. And everyone in the room knew it. Nobody slept well the night before the final assessment. Walker knew this not because anyone told him, but because he had been running culminating evaluations long enough to recognize what the facility felt like at 0500, when everyone inside it was already awake and pretending otherwise. The particular quality of silence that wasn't actually silence. The way the lights in the candidate bunk area were dark, but the shadows under the doors weren't quite right. He sat in his office with a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago and looked at the document on his desk. The modified final assessment parameters. He had changed them the previous evening after the debrief, after the room had gone quiet in that particular way, after Mitchell had said what he said, and Avery had said what she said, and the air in that room had shifted into something Walker hadn't experienced in 11 years of running this program. He had gone back to his office and sat for 40 minutes, and then he had opened the parameters document and changed one number. The original final target distance was 950 meters. He had changed it to 1200. He sat with his cold coffee and looked at that number for a long time. 1200 meters was not an evaluation distance. 1200 meters was a distance that existed in documented operational records and in the kind of long-range precision shooting literature that most evaluation programs referenced theoretically and never attempted practically. 1,200 meters under controlled range conditions, with ideal weather and a static target, was a different challenge entirely from 1,200 meters in the real world. But it was still, by any standard, the Naval Special Warfare Training Program, officially recognized beyond the scope of a culminating evaluation. Walker had never set a final target beyond 1,000 meters. He was setting it at 1,200. He looked at the number. He thought about what Reyes had said. She wasn't degrading. She was improving. He thought about what Mitchell had said. We designed this evaluation for a specific range of performance. You're outside that range, not below it. He thought about a Wyoming hunting guide named Hollis who had written, "She doesn't calculate the shot. She waits until she understands what it wants to be, and then she lets it be that." He drank the cold coffee, and he left the number where it was. The announcement came at the 0700 briefing. Walker delivered it the way he delivered everything, directly, without preamble, without the kind of theatrical buildup that would have made it feel like a performance. The final assessment distance has been modified. Primary sequence will run to the standard intermediate benchmarks. The final target has been set at 1,200 meters. He watched the room. Bressler's face did the thing where the professional mask went up half a second too late, and Walker caught the expression underneath it. Something between impressed and alarmed. Price sat very still. Okafor looked at the table. Avery looked at Walker. Her expression was not the expression he had expected, and he wasn't entirely sure what he had expected. Concern maybe, or the flash of doubt that showed up in even the best candidates when the ceiling moved suddenly upward. He had seen confidence, and he had seen bravado, and he had seen the particular blankness of people who were afraid to show either and were performing neutrality instead. What he saw in Avery's face was attention. Pure forward-leaning, entirely undefended attention, like someone who had just been handed the most interesting problem of their life and couldn't wait to begin. 1,200 meters has not been attempted in any previous culminating evaluation in this program's history. Walker continued. I want to be clear about what that means. It means there is no benchmark standard to measure your performance against. You will be evaluated on process decision quality and execution integrity, not against a historical pass rate, because there isn't one, Bressler said. At what point does the range's crosswind pattern make that distance non-viable? When the candidates determine it's non-viable, Walker said. That determination is part of the evaluation. Silence. Then Mitchell from the side wall. Any other questions? Nobody had any other questions. The preparation time before the final sequence ran for 2 hours. The intermediate benchmarks came first. Distances. The candidates had already proven at structured to establish rhythm and confidence before the final evolution. Walker's team ran them cleanly through the morning, the data coming back solid across the board. No one showing the kind of degradation that sometimes appeared when the pressure of a culminating assessment compressed the precision out of candidates who had performed excellently under evaluation pressure. Avery's intermediate data was what it had been since day one, consistent, distributed, quiet. She spoke very little during the intermediate sequences. Not in the closed-off way of someone managing anxiety, in the concentrated way of someone who was fully present and didn't need to narrate the presence. Between the third and fourth intermediate benchmarks, she did something Walker noticed. She sat down on the ground behind the firing line, cross-legged, and closed her eyes. Not for long. Maybe 90 seconds. Price, who was standing near enough to observe later, told Walker that she wasn't sleeping and she wasn't doing anything performative. She was breathing in a pattern, slow and even. In for 4 hold, for 4 out for 8. She looked like someone listening to something, Price said. I don't know how else to describe it. Walker knew how to describe it. She was reading the wind before she needed to, building the picture while there was still time to build it slowly. Her father's voice running her the way it always did when she needed it. The first decision is understanding what the world is telling you. She stood up when the fourth intermediate sequence was called. Her first shot sent her mass. Her expression didn't change. At 10:30, the final evolution was announced, 1,200 meters. The entire evaluation team had assembled on the range. This was not standard protocol, Normally, senior instructors rotated in and out during the final sequence based on their assigned observation responsibilities. Today, everyone was there. Walker had not asked them to be. They had simply arrived one by one over the course of the morning until the full complement of instructors and senior evaluators stood at the observation line. There was also a second development that Walker had not fully anticipated. Word had traveled. Facilities like this one were small communities in the way that all closed professional communities were small. Information moved faster than official channels, and what moved fastest was anything unusual. The modified distance parameter had filtered through the facility by 0800. By 0930, Walker was aware that there were additional personnel present who had no official role in the evaluation. He did not send them away. The assessment required an honest environment, not a comfortable one. Witnesses were honest. Avery set up at the firing position. She went through her setup routine with the same methodical patience she had brought to every sequence on every day of the evaluation, checking, adjusting, breathing, settling. No performance, no acknowledgement of the audience. If the accumulated weight of observation was registering in her nervous system, her body was not sharing the information. Walker stood at the instructor line. Mitchell stood at his left. Reyes stood at his right. Nobody spoke. The first benchmark confirmation was called. Avery ran the opening sequence not at 1,200 meters, but at the intermediate distance that preceded it, a protocol check to confirm her system was running correctly before the final evolution. First shot confirm. Walker released a breath he hadn't been aware of holding. Mitchell said quietly, "She's locked in." "Yes," Walker said. Then the range controller called the final evolution. 1,200 meters. The first thing that happened was the wind changed. Not a small shift. A meaningful one. The crosswind pattern that had been running from the northwest all morning rotated nearly 40 degrees in less than a minute, which was unusual for this range at this time of day, and which Walker's meteorological system flagged with a yellow status alert that he saw on his tablet at the same moment that every candidate on the line felt it. Price, who was not firing in the final evolution, but was observing, said quietly to Okafor, "That's going to complicate the hold significantly." "Yes," Okafor said. Bressler said nothing. He was watching Avery through his binoculars. Avery had not moved, not into position, and not away from it. She remained exactly where she had been when the wind changed, settled still, her red already adjusting without any visible external shift in her posture. Walker looked at his tablet. The wind sensor data was running in real time. Direction 37 degrees off the previous line. Speed building. "She's going to need to recalculate the entire hold," Reyes said. "She's doing it now," Walker said. "She hasn't moved. She's doing it internally." Walker watched her. "She's been reading this wind since this morning. She doesn't need to start from zero." The wind continued to build. At the instructor line, Walker was aware of the particular tension that inhabits a space when a large number of experienced professionals are watching something they cannot predict. It was not an unpleasant tension. It was the tension of genuine uncertainty, the rarest and most valuable thing a training environment could produce. Nobody knew what was about to happen. That was the truth, and they all felt it, and none of them looked away. Avery made her first adjustment at the 4-minute mark. A single small movement, the kind of adjustment that looks trivial from outside and represents an entire recalculation of the ballistic solution from inside. She did not rush it. She did not appear to be fighting the urge to rush, which was different and harder. She had simply arrived at a state where the urgency of the situation and the patience required by the situation were not in conflict. Mitchell had his binoculars up. "Wind still building," he said. "I know," Walker said. "If it hits 18 knots sustained, the hold becomes—" "She knows," Walker said. Mitchell lowered the binoculars slightly. He was quiet for a moment. "She's not waiting for the wind to settle," he said. "Not as a criticism, as an observation." "She's waiting for her read to be complete," Walker said. "Those are different things. Those are very different things." Walker watched her. In his 19 years, he had seen two kinds of patience on a firing line. The first was the patience of someone who was afraid to shoot, who kept finding reasons to delay, kept adjusting, kept recalibrating, not because the situation required it, but because the fear of the shot was larger than the commitment to taking it. That patience felt like stalling. It had a quality of retreat. The second kind was rarer. It was the patience of someone who had nothing to prove and everything to learn, who waited not because they were afraid, but because they genuinely weren't finished receiving information. That patience felt like attention. It had a quality of leaning forward without moving. Avery was the second kind. Walker had known this since day one, but watching it at 1,200 meters, with the wind building and the observation line silent, and everything on the line, he felt the full weight of what it meant in a way he hadn't felt it before. He was watching someone operate entirely without ego, not without confidence. Confidence was there, solid and deep, the kind you couldn't manufacture. But the part of human performance that needed to prove, needed to assert, needed the result, to say something about the person beyond the work itself, was entirely absent. She was not trying to make this shot. She was trying to understand it. And then when she understood it, she would let it be what it wanted to be. 5 minutes and 20 seconds after settling into position, she made a second adjustment. One small correction to her elevation hold. She breathed. The shot broke at 5 minutes and 41 seconds. Walker did not see the impact. Nobody at the instructor line saw the impact in real time. They watched Avery's position, the discipline of the follow-through, the complete absence of anticipation. Flinch. The hold that continued through and past the moment of firing, as if the rifle's job and the shooter's job were two separate things that happened to overlap in the same moment. Then the range's spotting system confirmed. The single tone that meant the round had reached the target. Then the visual confirmation from the downrange observer position. One word through the radio: impact. Nobody spoke. Walker had time to feel in the space between the confirmation and the first human response. Exactly. One coherent thought that he would remember this moment for the rest of his career. Then, Bressler said under his breath, without theater or performance, the way a man says something true, when truth is the only available language. My God. And the range came alive. Not loudly. Not with the kind of celebration that makes noise for its own sake. The people assembled on that observation line were not people who celebrated loudly. They were people who had spent careers learning to respond to remarkable things with composed professionalism. But composed professionalism had a texture, and the texture in that moment was unmistakable. It was the texture of people who had just witnessed something they would spend a long time afterward trying to put into words and consistently failing to put into words correctly. Walker walked to the firing position. He was not sure what he was going to say before he arrived. Avery was rising from her position with the same methodical care she brought to everything. No performance, no looking around at the assembled observers. No acknowledgement of the weight of the moment beyond the quiet completion of her post-fire routine. Walker stopped 2 feet from her. She looked at him. He said, I modified the evaluation parameters last night because I believed you could attempt that distance. She waited. I was right, he said. But I also owe you something, and I want to say it clearly. He held the eye contact. I read your file before this evaluation, and I made a decision before I saw you perform. The decision was that your age and your background were more significant than your capability. I was wrong. And the evaluation you received on day one was not the evaluation you deserved. Avery was quiet for a moment. I knew, she said. I know you knew. It didn't change what I came here to do. That's the part I want to make sure we both understand, Walker said. What you came here to do wasn't to prove anyone wrong. She shook her head. No. What was it? She answered without hesitating. To find out what I'm capable of. To see where my ceiling actually is. A pause. My father never told me where my ceiling was. He said the ceiling is the last thing you find, and you only find it by going until you hit it. She looked at the firing line, then back at Walker. I haven't hit it yet. Walker stood with that. Then he said, I don't think you have either. Mitchell reached her 30 seconds later. He did not extend his hand immediately. He stood in front of her for a moment, and his expression was the expression Walker had never seen on Mitchell in 11 years, open in a way that wasn't calculated, carrying something personal. That was the finest demonstration of applied precision shooting I have ever witnessed in an evaluation context, Mitchell said. And I've been a part of this program for 9 years. Avery looked at him steadily. Your father, Mitchell said. And then he stopped. She waited. Your father was an extraordinary teacher, Mitchell said. Whatever he built in you, I want you to understand that it shows. Not just the technique, the philosophy of it. He paused again, and Walker could see it cost him something. I was not charitable to you on day one. I told myself it was professional skepticism. It wasn't entirely that. I know, Avery said. And then, with a directness that Walker didn't expect, you were protecting something. Mitchell looked at her. Your standard, she said. Not unkindly, completely without accusation. You've built something over a long time. You protect it. That makes sense. Mitchell was quiet for a beat. That's a generous reading. It's an honest one. She picked up her rifle case. And you changed. That matters more than where you started. Mitchell stood where he was as she moved past him toward the staging area. He turned to Walker. He did not say anything. He didn't need to. The debriefing that followed the final sequence was unlike any evaluation debrief Walker had run. They sat in the same room they had occupied every evening for the past 5 days, and the atmosphere was something that Walker, a precise man who preferred precise language, found himself unable to precisely describe. It was not celebratory. It was not the professional satisfaction of a well-executed training event. It was the particular quality of a room full of people who had all learned something they hadn't planned to learn. Walker opened with the objective data. Standard protocol. The numbers were extraordinary, but he presented them the way he presented all numbers, without theater with accuracy. Then he departed from the standard debrief format for the second time in the same evaluation. I want to use this time differently tonight, he said. I want to ask each of you a question, not about shooting, about what this week changed for you. Bressler went first. He talked about the wind compression read about the moment on day 2 when Avery had called the shift 2 seconds ahead, and he had felt for the first time in 8 years that he was learning something foundational from someone he had assumed he had nothing to learn from. He said it plainly without drama, the way honest men say true things. Price talked about the coordination protocol, about watching Avery manage 2 simultaneous communication threads in real time and realizing that he had been thinking about operational communication as a sequential process when it was actually or could actually be a parallel one. He said he had spent 4 days revising his entire mental model of how he managed information under pressure. Okafor talked about patience. He said he had always understood patience as the discipline to wait when you wanted to move. Watching Avery, he said he had learned that patience was actually something more active than that. It was the discipline to remain fully open while waiting, so that when the moment came, nothing in you was already committed to a decision you'd made before the information was complete. Then, Mitchell. Mitchell was quiet for longer than the others before he spoke. I came into this evaluation with a framework I've been using for a long time, he said. The framework was built on the assumption that excellence in this field comes from a specific path. Military background, institutional training, years of operational experience. Those things matter. I still believe they matter. He paused. But I confused the path with the destination. Nobody in the room spoke. The destination is the ability to perform with precision and clarity under conditions that challenge everything you know. There are multiple paths to that destination. I had only accounted for one. He looked at Avery. You showed me the map is bigger than I thought it was. Avery said, My father always said the map isn't the territory, that the territory is always bigger. He sounds like he was very wise, Okafor said. Something happened in Avery's face, that same flicker Walker had seen in the previous debrief there, and then controlled the private earthquake that stayed mostly underground. He was the wisest person I've known. How long has he been gone? Bressler asked, quietly. The way someone asks when they already suspect the answer will cost something. 14 months, she said. The room held the number. He knew about this evaluation, Price asked. He pushed me to apply. She looked at her hands for a moment. He said he needed to know before he was gone that I could do this without him. Her voice remained level, completely, deliberately level. He trained me to be ready for something like this. He wanted to know the training had worked. Did he know? Walker asked. She looked up. The acceptance letter came 3 days before he died. A pause. He read it. The room was completely still. Walker understood something in that silence that he had not quite understood before, despite having read the file, despite having known the timeline. He understood the full weight of what Avery was carrying onto that range every morning. Not grief as a burden. Grief as a purpose. The specific and profound motivation of someone who is completing a task on behalf of someone who needed to know it could be completed. She hadn't come to this evaluation to prove herself. She had come to honor a promise. And 1,200 meters was not the ceiling Robert Carter had wanted her to find. It was the proof of concept. It was the evidence that everything he had built in her over all those years on hillsides in Wyoming and Nevada, with wind in their ears and targets in the distance, and his voice explaining what the world was telling them, all of it had worked. All of it was real. Walker opened his mouth and then closed it again. Then he said the only true thing he could find. He would be very proud of you tonight. Avery looked at him for a long moment. I know, she said. Not as arrogance, as peace. The peace of someone who had spent 14 months living inside a loss and had found on the other side of it that the person she lost had given her everything she needed to survive, not just the loss, but everything that came after. Walker closed the formal debrief. The candidates began moving toward the door. Avery was the last to leave. At the door, she stopped and looked back at the room, at the tables and the chairs and the evaluation notes stacked at the front, and Walker watched her look at it the way people look at places where something important happened before they leave them. Then she walked out, and the room was empty, and Walker stood in it for a long time, because some rooms need to be stood in after the thing that matters has happened, and before the world moves forward into whatever comes next. Outside, the wind was still running across the range. 1,200 meters of it. And somewhere in the direction of Wyoming, a man who had spent 30 years teaching his daughter to listen to that wind had gotten his answer. The training had worked. Everything was real. Walker didn't sleep that night either, but this time, it wasn't the anticipatory insomnia of someone waiting for an outcome. This time, it was something different. The kind of wakefulness that comes after a significant thing has happened, and your mind refuses to file it away because it isn't finished processing what the thing means. He sat at his desk at 0230 and wrote, not evaluation notes, not official documentation. He wrote longhand in the legal pad he kept in the bottom drawer of his desk that he had been writing in for 11 years, the one that held observations too honest for official reports and too important to lose. He wrote about the shot. He wrote about the debrief. He wrote about the moment Avery had told them her father read the acceptance letter 3 days before he died. He wrote, I have spent 19 years in this program, evaluating human capability under pressure. Tonight, I watched a 17-year-old girl carry the weight of a dead man's faith in her and perform the finest precision shooting I have ever witnessed in this facility. The question I cannot answer is whether what she did tonight was exceptional because of her talent or because of her loss. I am beginning to think those are not separable things. That the love and the loss and the capability were all built together, and you cannot have the shot without the grief, and the grief would be unbearable without the shot. Her father didn't just teach her to shoot. He gave her a reason to be extraordinary that outlasted him. He stopped writing. He sat with that for a while. Then he picked up his phone and called Admiral Dennis Hargrove. It was 0245. Hargrove picked up on the third ring, which meant he wasn't asleep either, which meant news of the 1,200-meter shot had already traveled further than Walker had anticipated. "Walker," Hargrove said. "Admiral?" "I heard 1,200 meters." "Yes, sir." "First time in program history." "Yes, sir." A pause. "Tell me about her," Walker told him. He told him about day one, the worn rifle case, the sideways glances, the wind flag observation. He told him about the conversation exercise, about the coordination protocol, about the debrief, where she had explained the parallel communication thread concept to 3 special operations veterans with the patience of someone who had been doing it for years. He told him about Wyoming and the hunting guide and the letter. He told him about Robert Carter. When he finished, Hargrove was quiet for a moment. "What are you recommending?" Hargrove asked. "Advanced Development Program," Walker said. "The Tier 1 candidate track." Another pause. Longer this time. "She's 17, Walker." "I know, sir. The program is designed for candidates with—" "I know what it's designed for, Admiral." Walker kept his voice level. "I also know that what I witnessed tonight has never been documented in this facility. If we send her back and put her in a standard developmental pipeline, we will spend 3 years giving her information she already has and hoping the institutional structure doesn't sand down the thing that makes her unique." Hargrove said nothing. "The Tier 1 track would give her access to the instruction that's actually ahead of her current level," Walker said. "Not instruction she's already surpassed." A very long pause. "Write it up," Hargrove said finally. "Full recommendation package. I want it on my desk by end of week." "Yes, sir." "And Walker." A pause. "Good evaluation." The line went dead. Walker set the phone down. He looked at the legal pad. He wrote one more line. "Tomorrow everything changes for her. She doesn't know that yet. Tonight she's just a kid who needs sleep." He closed the pad. He did not sleep, but he stopped fighting the wakefulness, and that was close enough. Morning came, the way it always came. After significant nights too quickly, with too much light carrying the ordinary texture of routine that felt strange against the extraordinary weight of what had happened the evening before. Avery was at breakfast at 0630. She was eating alone at the end of one of the long tables, her notebook open beside her tray, writing the way she always wrote, fully absorbed. Left hand curled around the pen in the grip her father had noticed when she was 6 years old, and corrected because he said the grip mattered even in writing, that the way you held something told you things about how you intended to use it. Bressler arrived at 0640. He saw her. He picked up his tray and walked past 4 empty tables and sat down across from her. She looked up. "Morning," he said. "Morning." He started eating. She kept writing. After about 2 minutes without looking up from her notebook, "You can ask." Bressler looked at her. "How do you know I have a question? You sat across from me instead of beside me. People who want to talk sit across. People who just want company sit beside." Bressler stared at her for a moment, then a short, genuine laugh. "Your father teach you that too?" "My mother, actually." It was the first time she had mentioned her mother. Bressler registered this and said nothing about it, which was the right call. "How long have you been writing in that thing?" he asked instead, nodding at the notebook. "Since I was 9. My father gave it to me after my first real long-range session. He said the learning doesn't consolidate until you write it down." She paused. "I'm on my 14th notebook." Bressler put down his fork. 14. He said documentation is the difference between experience and wisdom. Experience just happens to you. Wisdom is what you make of it after. Bressler was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm going to start carrying a notebook." She looked up, not smiling exactly, but something in her expression that was close to it. "It changes how you watch things." "I believe you." He picked his fork back up. "You know that Walker called someone last night, after the debrief?" Avery went still for a fraction of a second. "How do you know that? Facilities like this one have thin walls and people who don't sleep." He met her eyes. "I heard his voice through the office door around 0300. Couldn't hear the words, but the tone was the tone of someone making a case for something. Avery looked at him steadily. You think he was recommending something? I think he was recommending you for something specific. Bressler leaned forward slightly. You should be ready for that conversation. What kind of ready? The kind where you know what you want before someone else defines it for you. He held her gaze. You've spent this whole evaluation being evaluated. Today the evaluation is over, and someone's going to offer you a path. Make sure it's your path. Avery looked at her notebook. Something moved across her face, not uncertainty, but the deep attention of someone genuinely considering something for the first time. My father always chose the path, she said quietly. Not with resentment, with honesty. He's not here anymore, Bressler said, gently but directly. No. She closed the notebook. He's not. They sat in the quiet of that for a moment. Then Okafor arrived with his tray, looked at the two of them, and sat beside Avery without a word. Right beside her. The position Bressler had identified as someone who just wanted company. Avery noticed. The corners of her mouth moved. Good morning, Okafor. Good morning. He began eating with complete calm. After a moment, I've been thinking about parallel communication threading since 0400. I think there's an application in close quarters coordination that nobody's documented yet. Tell me, she said. And he did. And the morning continued ordinary and extraordinary at the same time, the way mornings always are when they follow nights that mattered. Walker found Mitchell at the range at 0800. Mitchell was alone at the long-range firing line running his own rounds through a sequence that had no evaluation purpose. He was working something out through the shooting, the way certain people worked things out through movement, and Walker recognized this and stopped at a respectful distance until Mitchell ran through his sequence and stood. Good group, Walker said. Not as good as it should be. Mitchell walked back from the line. I've been sloppy on my compression read for about 3 months. I've been compensating technically and calling it adequate. And watching someone 17 years old do it correctly at 1200 meters made the compensation feel exactly like what it is. He ejected the magazine with a practiced motion. I'm going back to fundamentals on my atmospheric read, starting today. Walker looked at him. She taught you something. She reminded me of something I'd stopped paying attention to. Mitchell turned to face Walker fully. There's a difference. I knew the technique. I stopped practicing it because the compensation was sufficient. He paused. She doesn't compensate. She executes. I'd forgotten what that looks like from the inside. Walker filed this away. Then, I called Hargrove last night. Mitchell's expression sharpened. Tier 1 track recommendation. Yes. Good. Walker looked at him. You were expecting it. I would have been surprised by anything else. Mitchell set his rifle down. What did Hargrove say? He said write it up. Walker paused. He also said she's 17. She's also better than anyone I've seen at this level in 9 years. Mitchell's voice was flat and factual, carrying no residual resistance. The resistance was gone. Completely gone, and Walker was still adjusting to the absence of it, the way a room felt different after furniture you'd always worked around was removed. The program's age parameters exist to ensure candidates have sufficient developmental foundation. She has a developmental foundation that's different from what the parameters anticipated. That's not a disqualifier. That's a design gap in the parameters. You sound like you've been preparing this argument. I have been, since about midnight. Mitchell looked down the range. If she gets put in the standard pipeline, the program loses whatever she is. She'll perform well, and the institution will absorb her and sand off the parts that don't fit the standard model. And the parts that don't fit are the most important parts. Walker was quiet for a moment. When did you become her advocate? He asked. Mitchell turned and looked at him with an expression that was entirely unguarded in a way Walker hadn't seen on him before. Open and slightly rueful, the look of a man who has been surprised by his own position and is choosing to own it rather than explain it away. About 48 hours ago, Mitchell said, when she told me that I was protecting something instead of evaluating something. And she was right. and she said it without making me feel like I deserved to feel small about it. A pause. You don't forgive someone easily for showing you a blind spot, but you respect them for it. And respect for me turns into advocacy pretty quickly when the person who earned the respect is up against a system that's going to minimize them. She's up against a system that's about to offer her a significant opportunity, Walker said. Then make sure the opportunity is actually significant, Mitchell said. Don't offer her a version of the Tier 1 track that's been adjusted to account for her age and wrapped in administrative language that turns it into something smaller. Give her the full program. Give her access to the full instruction level. He held Walker's eyes. She earned it. Don't discount it on delivery. Walker looked at him for a long moment. Then, you want to be in the room when I talk to her? Yes. Why? Because I owe her the best version of this conversation, and I can make sure she's not talked into a smaller version of her own future. Mitchell picked his rifle back up. And because her father isn't here, and someone with standing in this community should be in that room saying clearly that she belongs in it. Walker nodded once. 1400, he said. My office. He walked back toward the facility. Behind him, he heard Mitchell running another sequence at the long-range line working his compression. Read back toward the standard that a 17-year-old girl had reminded him he'd allowed to slip. Price found Avery at 1100. She was at the equipment staging area cleaning her rifle with the deliberate care of someone who had been taught that maintenance was not separate from respect. That the way you cared for a tool was the way you cared for the work it represented. Price sat down across from her and waited while she finished the section she was working on. This was Walker, later noted when Price described it to him itself. Significant Price was not a patient man by nature, and the fact that he waited without fidgeting meant something had changed in him over the course of the week. When she set the cloth down, he said, I want to ask you something, and I want you to know I'm asking because I respect you enough to ask directly. She looked at him. Okay. On day 1, when Bressler asked if it was your first time on a formal range. He paused. Your answer was no, but the way he asked it was condescending. You knew it was condescending. Yes. And you just said no and went back to reading the range. Yes. Why? His voice was genuinely curious, carrying none of the challenge it might have carried a week ago. I've been in situations where I was underestimated, and my instinct is always to correct it immediately, to establish the truth of the situation as quickly as possible. You didn't do that. He leaned forward. You didn't defend yourself once this entire week. Avery was quiet for a moment. She picked up the cloth again, not to use it, just to hold. A small grounding habit. My father said that the people who need to prove themselves the most are the ones who trust their ability. The least, she said. That real confidence isn't loud. It doesn't need to correct the record immediately because it knows the record will correct itself. And if it doesn't correct itself, then you do it with your work. She set the cloth down again. Words are quick. Work is slower. But work is what actually stays. Price sat with that. I owe you an apology, he said. I had a position about you in the first 24 hours that wasn't based on evaluation. It was based on assumption. I know. That doesn't bother you. It bothers me in the abstract, she said carefully. In the specific, no, because I've been dealing with it since I was 11 years old and took my first documented shot at a regional competition, and 3 adult men told my father they weren't aware the junior girls division was running concurrently with the main event. Price stared at her. He told them I was in the main event, she said. And then he walked away and told me to let the next shot answer for both of us. And I won the main event. A beat. The 3 men didn't apologize. My father said that wasn't the point. The point was, I knew the answer, and now they did too, even if they couldn't say it out loud. Price shook his head slowly. He was teaching you about dignity. He was teaching me that your worth doesn't live in other people's acknowledgement of it, she said. It lives in you, and if you're solid in there, the outside noise is just noise. Price looked at her for a long moment. Then, I'm going to tell my daughter that story. Avery looked at her. A genuine surprise, the first fully unguarded reaction Walker would later hear, described the first moment where the composure cracked just slightly and something young and human came through. You have a daughter, 8 years old. A quiet pride in it. She's already asking why the girls at her school are told to be quiet when the boys get to be loud. He paused. I haven't known what to tell her. Tell her the work is the answer, Avery said. Tell her to do the work at the level she's capable of and let it speak for her. And to protect her dignity in here. She touched her own chest, even when the outside is trying to convince her it doesn't exist. Price was quiet for a long time. Then, thank you. She nodded, went back to her rifle. He sat there for another few minutes not saying anything, just sitting beside her. The way you sit beside someone when the conversation has given you something too large to carry out of the room immediately, and you need another minute before the weight becomes portable. The 1400 meeting was in Walker's office. Avery arrived at exactly 1400. Not at 1358 with nervous early energy, not at 1402 with deliberate late performance. Exactly on time, which Walker recognized as its own form of communication. Mitchell was already there standing against the wall. Reyes was there. And Walker had added one person he hadn't mentioned to Mitchell. Admiral Hargrove's office had called at 11:30 and said the Admiral wanted to join by video, and Walker had said yes. Avery looked at the screen when she came in. Hargrove's image, his 4 stars. The office behind him that spoke the language of consequence and institutional authority. She looked at Walker. Admiral Hargrove. He wanted to be part of this conversation, Walker said. Is that all right with you? A brief pause. Yes. She sat down. Hargrove spoke first. He was a man who had spent 40 years learning when to dispense with preamble, and this was not a preamble situation. Miss Carter, I've read Commander Walker's preliminary report on your evaluation performance. I want to tell you directly that what you achieved yesterday represents the highest level of demonstrated precision capability in this program's history. Avery held the screen's attention without visible discomfort. Thank you, Admiral. Commander Walker is recommending you for the Tier 1 Advanced Development track. A pause. This track was designed for candidates with significant operational background. You are the first candidate without that background to be recommended for it. I understand. I want to ask you something before we discuss the logistics, Hargrove said. And I want an honest answer, not a polished one. Yes, sir. Are you ready for what comes after this room? The question landed with weight. Walker watched Avery's face, watched her actually consider the question rather than instinctively deflecting it with confidence. I don't know the full shape of it, she said finally. I know my capability. I know where my gaps are. I know that what I learned here already revealed gaps I didn't know I had. She paused. But I'm not afraid of gaps. Gaps are where the next part of the work is. Hargrove was quiet for a moment. Then almost to himself, Robert Carter's daughter. Avery went very still. Your father competed at the national level in the mid-90s, Hargrove said. I saw him shoot once, at a demonstration event in Colorado. He looked directly into the camera. He was the most patient shooter I ever watched. I've been thinking about that since Walker's report came across my desk. Avery's composure was intact, but her hands on the table moved in a small, involuntary way, a brief adjustment that Walker recognized as the physical expression of something interior becoming almost too much to hold. He never mentioned that, she said. He wouldn't have, Hargrove said. He wasn't a man who talked about what he'd done. I could tell that from watching him for 40 minutes. A pause. He would be very proud of what you did on that range yesterday. Thank you, Admiral. Her voice was steady, completely steady. But the steadiness was costing her something, and everyone in the room knew it, and nobody said anything about it, because some costs are private, even when they're visible. Then Walker spoke, and what he said next was the twist that nobody in the room, including Avery, had anticipated. There's a second component to the recommendation, he said. Mitchell looked at him. Even Mitchell didn't know this part. Walker slid a single document across the desk. Avery looked at it, read it. Her expression shifted. This is a curriculum development consultancy role, she said slowly. In addition to the Tier 1 track participation, Walker said. Not instead of, in addition. She looked up. You want me to help develop the evaluation curriculum, specifically the environmental read components and the multivariable coordination protocols. Walker held her eyes. The techniques you brought into this evaluation are not in our current training framework. The parallel communication threading you demonstrated in the team. Evolution. We have no documentation of that methodology anywhere in our program materials. The atmospheric compression read. I can't teach that in a classroom, she said immediately. It's not a classroom skill. It has to be developed in conditions. We know, Reyes said, speaking for the first time. That's the point. We need someone who can help us build the conditions component. I'm 17. You're also the only person who walked into this program already doing the things we want to teach, Walker said. Age is a data point. It's not the defining data point. Avery looked at the document again. Then she looked at Mitchell. He said, This is unprecedented. Everything about this is unprecedented. Your father gave you an education that this program hasn't been able to replicate through any institutional methodology we've developed in 30 years. He paused. We're asking you to help us understand what he built so we can try to build it in others. That's not an administrative role. It's a significant one. She was quiet for a long time. Walker let her be quiet. Outside his office window. He was aware of the range, the wind crossing it, the flags moving at the two ends with their slight variance that Avery had identified on her first morning. He was aware of the distance between where they were sitting and where 1,200 meters was. My father would say this is the next problem to solve, she said finally. Is that a yes? Hargrove asked. It's a yes with a condition. She looked at the screen directly. I want to pilot the conditions-based curriculum component at a live evaluation, not in a design room. I want to develop it by running it with actual candidates, not by writing it in a document and hoping it translates. Walker looked at Hargrove's image. Hargrove said, Terms are acceptable. Then yes, Avery said. The word sat in the room with its full weight. Then Mitchell said, Your father would have liked this room. He would have asked too many questions, Avery said. And the thing that moved across her face was unmistakably a smile, brief and real, and carrying the specific quality of humor that belongs to grief. When grief has moved past the first unbearable stage and found somewhere inside itself the capacity for joy. He always asked too many questions. Good teachers do, Walker said. She looked at him. He was a great teacher, Walker said simply. The evidence is sitting in this room. Avery looked down at the document in front of her. Then she picked up the pen Walker had placed beside it. Not her own pen, a program issue pen, the kind without personal significance, and she signed her name at the bottom of the page. The room held that moment. Outside the flags moved. The wind ran its full length across the range, 1,200 meters of open air between the point of origin and the target. Avery Carter had signed her name to the next part of her life, and somewhere in Wyoming, in the direction that the wind was coming from something permanent and completed and entirely finally at rest, settled into the particular piece of a promise that has been kept. That evening, after everyone else had cleared the facility, Walker went back to the range. He stood at the 1,200-meter firing line. He looked down the range at the target position, the target that had been hit the previous day, now reset standing clean and neutral in the late-day air, as if nothing historic had happened in front of it. He thought about what Mitchell had said. We designed this evaluation for a specific range of performance. You're outside that range. I thought about the legal pad in his desk drawer and the sentence he'd written at 0230, the love and the loss and the capability were all built together, and you cannot have the shot without the grief. He thought about Robert Carter, who had trained his daughter in Wyoming hills and Nevada ranges, and wherever else the conditions were available, who had built in her something that 30 years of institutional program development had not been able to replicate, who had read an acceptance letter 3 days before he died, and had known in the specific certain way that great teachers know that the work had held. Walker looked at the 1,200-meter target for a long time. Then he turned and walked back toward the facility, where inside in the bunk area, a 17-year-old girl was writing in her 14th notebook, filling it with what she had learned in 5 days, the way her father had taught her, because the learning doesn't consolidate until you write it down. And experience is just something that happens to you, and wisdom is what you make of it after. The notebook was full by midnight. Avery had written 43 pages since the afternoon meeting, filling the last sections of her 14th notebook with the kind of concentrated documentation that her father had trained her to produce immediately after significant experiences, before the details softened and the edges blurred, and memory began its quiet work of revision. She wrote about the meeting. She wrote about Hargrove's face on the screen and the specific quality of his silence before he spoke. She wrote about the document and the program issue pen and the exact sensation of signing her name to something she couldn't fully see the shape of yet. She wrote about what Mitchell had said and what Walker had said, and the thing Price had told her about his 8-year-old daughter, asking why girls were told to be quiet when boys got to be loud. She wrote about her father. Not in the formal way, not in the way of summary or tribute. She wrote the specific memory of the Colorado competition, the one Hargrove had mentioned. She had been 8 years old, sitting beside her father in the bleachers while he watched the demonstration event, and he had turned to her at one point without warning and said, "You see how he waits? He's not waiting for the right moment. He's waiting until he runs out of wrong ones." She had not known at 8 years old that she was being taught. She knew now. She closed the 14th notebook and set it on the side table and opened the 15th, which she had packed alongside it because she always traveled with two, because her father had told her that running out of pages in the middle of important experiences was a kind of failure of preparation. At the top of the first page of the new notebook, she wrote a single line, the next part of the work. Then she turned off the light. She did not sleep for a while, but the wakefulness was not anxious. It was the wakefulness of someone standing at the edge of a significant threshold, looking forward rather than back, trying to see the shape of what was coming. Not with worry, but with the same patient attention she brought to reading wind. The facility was quiet around her. Somewhere down the hall, she heard Bressler's door open and close. He was a light sleeper. He'd mentioned it. The operational habit of 15 years that his nervous system had never entirely relinquished. She heard Okafor's low voice through the wall, probably calling his wife the way he did every night at the same time, regardless of what the day had held. She thought about her own mother. A brief thought, not painful the way it used to be. Her parents had been separated since she was 9. Not bitterly, just the quiet incompatibility of two people who loved each other and couldn't live together. And her mother had remarried 2 years ago and was happy in Phoenix and called every Sunday. She would call her Sunday. She would tell her about the 1,200 meters. Her mother would say, "Your father trained you for exactly this." He knew. She already knew her mother would say that, because it was true. She closed her eyes. The wind moved outside the window. She read it out of habit, the way she breathed, not deliberately, just continuously, the way her father had said it would become once it was real. You won't have to try. You'll just always be listening. She was always listening. She slept. Walker's formal recommendation package landed on Hargrove's desk at 0900 the following morning, 47 pages, including performance data, evaluator assessments, curriculum development proposal framework, and a 2-page personal statement that Walker had written and rewritten 4 times before deciding the 4th version was the honest one. The personal statement said, among other things, "In 19 years of evaluation work, I have recommended 63 candidates for advanced development tracks. This is the first recommendation I have written, in which I believe the program will benefit from the candidate's participation, as much as or more than the candidate will benefit from the program's instruction. Avery Carter does not need what we teach. She needs access to the environment in which she can continue developing what she already possesses. Our responsibility is to provide that environment and to be honest enough to learn from what we observe within it." Hargrove read the package in full. Then he called his deputy and said, "Process the Carter recommendation, full Tier 1 parameters, no modifications for age, and flag the curriculum development component for the program director's review. I want that pilot evaluation scheduled within 90 days. His deputy paused. Sir, the standard review period for Tier 1 recommendations is— I'm aware of the standard review period, Hargrove said. Schedule the review for next week. The deputy said, Yes, sir. The call ended. Hargrove sat for a moment looking at the page in Walker's report that contained Avery's performance data from the final evaluation. He looked at the 1200-meter confirmation entry. He looked at the atmospheric sensor comparison data, showing her compression read, preceding the sensor alert by 2.4 seconds. I thought about Colorado in 1994. A demonstration range on a bright October afternoon. A man named Robert Carter settling into position with the particular stillness of someone who had completely stopped fighting the environment and started listening to it instead. He picked up his pen. He wrote in the margin of Walker's report, in the narrow script of a man who had been making marginal notes on important documents for 4 decades, like father, like daughter. The patient ones always surprise you. They're the only ones who should. He initialed it. He closed the report. Avery spent her last morning at the facility doing something nobody expected. She asked Walker if she could use the range. Not for evaluation, not for documentation, just to shoot. Walker said yes without hesitation. She went out at 07:30 with her rifle and her notebook, and no observers, or so she thought. What she didn't know was that by 0800, every candidate from the evaluation and 4 of the 6 senior instructors had quietly drifted to positions where they could watch without making the watching official. Bressler told Okafor afterward that it was the most interesting 40 minutes he'd spent on a range that wasn't operationally consequential. She didn't shoot at 1200 meters. She shot at 400, at 600, at 800 distances. She had cleared cleanly during the evaluation, and she ran each distance not in the sequence pattern of the evaluation, but in what Reyes watching described as a conversation. She would shoot, right wait. Shoot, right wait. Sometimes she would hold for 2 or 3 minutes between shots, head down over the notebook writing fast. What is she doing? Price asked Reyes quietly. Documenting her own process in real time, Reyes said. She's studying herself. Why? Reyes watched her for another moment. Because she's going to teach this. And she knows that the hardest thing to teach is the thing that feels natural to you. She's trying to externalize it while it's still fresh. He paused. She's converting experience into curriculum. Price stared at him. She's doing the curriculum development work right now, on the range, the morning after she signed the agreement. Yes. She's 17. You keep saying that, Reyes said not unkindly. I keep needing to say it, Price said, because I keep forgetting it and then remembering it and being surprised all over again. At the 800-meter line, Avery paused for longer than usual. She set the notebook down, picked the rifle up, and instead of running her standard pre-fire routine, she went completely still. The absolute inhabited stillness that the instructors had been watching all week. The stillness that wasn't the absence of movement, but the presence of something larger than movement. She stayed that way for almost 90 seconds. Then she fired. The round hit center mass. She did not look at the target. She opened the notebook and wrote for 30 seconds. Then she looked up and out at the range and stayed very still again, and everyone watching understood, without being told, that she was not looking at the target or the distance markers or any of the measurable documentable features of the range. She was reading the wind, just reading it, for its own sake, because it was there, and she was there, and reading it was what she did, and who she was as naturally and completely as breathing. Mitchell, who had arrived at the observation position at 0815 without announcing himself, said nothing for a long time. Then he said quietly to no one in particular, "Her father is here." Nobody asked what he meant. They all knew what he meant. The departure briefing was at 1100. Standard end of evaluation protocol, administrative closeout transport coordination, official record, handoff. Walker ran through it efficiently because the administrative layer of significant events deserved efficiency rather than ceremony. But at the end of the standard material, he stopped. Before we close out, he said, "I want to say something that isn't in the administrative record. The room was attentive in the particular way of people who had been through something significant together and were aware that the something was ending. "This evaluation produced results I didn't anticipate," Walker said. "That's not unusual. Evaluations are designed to reveal what you don't already know. But what was revealed in this one wasn't primarily about a candidate's performance." He paused. "It was about the assumptions we bring to evaluation and what happens when those assumptions are tested." He looked around the room. "Every person in this room revised a position this week. Some of you revised it quietly, privately, without making it part of the public record. Some of you revised it openly." He didn't look specifically at Mitchell, but Mitchell's jaw moved in a small, acknowledging way. "The willingness to revise is the most important professional quality in this work. More important than any technical skill, because the technical skills can be improved. The willingness to revise is a character quality, and character qualities either exist or they don't." Bressler said, "Or they get reminded of themselves." Walker looked at him. "Or they get reminded of themselves," he agreed. "She reminded me of mine," Bressler said simply. He wasn't performing it. He was just putting something true into the official air of the room, so it existed somewhere outside his own head. "She reminded all of us," Okafor said. Walker nodded. "That's the part I want on record. Not the 1,200-meter shot that's already documented. This part." He looked around the room one more time. That a 17-year-old girl walked into a room full of experienced professionals, carrying a worn rifle case and her father's voice in her head, and she changed how every person in this room thinks about their work. He paused. "That matters. And I want us all to remember that it happened, and why it happened, and what it means about who we should be paying attention to the next time someone walks through a door and doesn't look like what we expected." The room was quiet. Then Walker looked at Avery directly for the last time in an official evaluation context. "Thank you," he said, "for what you brought here, for what you showed us, and for the grace with which you let us learn it." Avery held his gaze. "Thank you for changing the distance," she said. A small smile crossed Walker's face, the first one in 5 days. "I thought you could handle it." "My father thought I could too." A beat. "You both turned out to be right." The first twist that nobody saw coming happened 30 minutes before departure. Mitchell asked to speak with Avery privately. They stood in the equipment room, just the two of them, the door half open, the sounds of administrative departure activity audible in the corridor. Mitchell had something in his hand. Avery looked at it. A notebook. Not her notebook. A different one. Government issue green. Cover the kind that military personnel had been using for field notes for decades. It looked worn in the way that things look worn when they've been carried for a long time. "This was my first field notebook," Mitchell said. "From my first deployment, 2003. He held it out to her. "I want you to have it." Avery looked at it, then at him. "Why?" "Because you reminded me why I started keeping one." He kept it extended. "I hadn't opened it in 8 years. I opened it last night after the debrief. The things I wrote in it at 23. The questions I had about reading conditions. The gaps I was aware of and trying to close. They're the same questions you're answering right now at 17. He paused. "I want you to see that. Because the questions don't go away no matter how good you get. They just become more precise. And that's not a problem. It's the point." Avery took the notebook. She opened it to the first page. Mitchell's handwriting, 23 years younger, less controlled, the handwriting of someone still becoming themselves. Day 1. Wind from the east at 0400 shifted by 0700. I miss the shift. I need to understand why I miss it before I can learn to read it. What is the difference between seeing and reading? She looked up. He asked that question too, she said softly. My father. He asked it differently, but it was the same question. What answer did he give you? He said seeing is what your eyes do. Reading is what your whole self does. She looked back at the page. He said you see with your training, but you read with everything you've become. Mitchell stood with that. Write that in mine, he said. On the inside cover, so I have it in his words. Avery looked at him. Then she took her pen. Her own pen, the one she'd carried all week. The one her mother had given her. The Christmas before her father died. And she opened Mitchell's notebook to the inside front cover, and she wrote, "Seeing is what your eyes do. Reading is what your whole self does. You see with your training, but you read with everything you've become." Robert Carter. She handed it back. Mitchell read it. His throat moved. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you for asking," she said. They stood for a moment in the particular quiet of two people who have reached the end of a significant conversation and are taking a beat before the ordinary world resumes. Then Mitchell said, "You're going to be extraordinary, Avery." She shook her head slightly. "I'm going to keep working." That's what extraordinary is. She thought about that. Then, "My father said extraordinary isn't a destination, it's a direction." He was right, Mitchell said. I was usually right. Something warm moved through her voice. It was very annoying. Mitchell laughed. A real one, unguarded and genuine, the laugh of a man who had been reminded this week that he was allowed to be human inside his professionalism. The best teachers always are. Walker walked her to the transport vehicle himself. This was not standard procedure. Walker was a man of procedure, and Avery had been in the program long enough to know the difference between what he did as protocol and what he did as choice. This was choice. They walked without talking for the first portion. The facility had a particular quality in the late morning light. Not that Walker was thinking about light, but the air had the specific weight of a California morning that was going to be warm by noon, and the wind was running from the northwest at a manageable 8 knots. And Avery read it automatically, without meaning to. And Walker saw her read it because he had been watching her read it for 5 days, and now he always saw it, and he thought that was probably not going to change. "You're going to face resistance in the Tier 1 track," Walker said. "I know. Not from everyone, but from some. And the resistance will be louder there than it was here because the stakes are higher and the personalities are stronger." "I know. You're going to need to do exactly what you did here," he said. "Let the work answer." "My father's advice." "Your father gave good advice." "He gave relentless advice," she said. "Morning, afternoon, evening, on the range, at dinner, sometimes in the middle of the night when he'd thought of something. It was a lot." A pause. "I would give anything to hear it again." Walker said nothing for a moment. Then, "When you're standing somewhere hard and you need to hear it, what do you do?" She was quiet for several steps. "I get still," she said. "I listen to what's around me, and I ask myself what he would say." She paused. "He always answers." Walker nodded. He believed this completely in the way that people who have spent their lives watching human capability under pressure learn to believe in the things that can't be measured but clearly exist. They reached the transport vehicle. Avery's bag was already loaded. The driver was waiting at a respectful distance. She turned to face Walker. He extended his hand. She shook it, a firm, clean handshake, the kind her father had taught her at age 7 standing in their kitchen in Nevada. "A handshake is a statement. Make it honest." "Commander Walker," she said. "Miss Carter." He held the handshake for 1 beat longer than professional standard. "Go do the work." "Yes, sir." She got into the vehicle. Walker stood where he was as it pulled away. He didn't move until it was entirely out of view. Then he stood there for another minute anyway, because some departures deserve more stillness than their duration requires, and this was one of them. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived at the facility addressed to Walker. Handwritten. 15's notebook paper torn cleanly at the edge. He recognized the handwriting from the evaluation documentation. It said, "Commander Walker. I've been running the conditions-based curriculum framework in practice since I left. Not formally, just on my own time at a local range with 3 shooters who asked me questions I couldn't answer without trying to build a structure for the answers. I think I understand now why the work you're asking me to do is important. It's not about transferring technique. It's about transferring the relationship to uncertainty. The technique can be taught in a classroom. The relationship has to be built in conditions. My father knew this. He spent 12 years building it in me before I knew it was being built. The question is whether we can compress that timeline without losing what makes it real. I think we can. I'll know more in 90 days. A. Carter. Walker read it twice. Then he put it in the bottom drawer with the legal pad. He thought about writing back. He decided against it. Not because there was nothing to say, but because the letter didn't need a response. It was not a question. It was a report from someone in the field doing exactly what they said they would do, advancing toward the next problem with the same patient, forward-leaning attention they brought to everything. He closed the drawer. The second twist came 6 weeks after departure. The program director called Walker into a meeting that included 3 senior personnel. Walker didn't know well. People from the institutional side of naval special warfare, the side that dealt with training architecture and long-term capability development, and the kind of systemic questions that individual evaluation programs didn't usually touch. The meeting was about Avery's curriculum proposal, not the 90-day pilot. Something larger. One of the personnel, Walker, didn't know a woman named Commander Chen, who ran the Training Architecture Division, put a document on the table and said, "We've reviewed the preliminary framework Miss Carter submitted last week." Walker looked at the document. He had not seen it. Avery had submitted directly to the program director's office, which was within the terms of the agreement, but which Walker hadn't anticipated she would do independently, and this quickly. She submitted a 40-page framework, Chen said, in 6 weeks, while simultaneously beginning her Tier 1 track participation. "Yes," Walker said. "The framework is..." Chen paused, and Walker recognized the pause as the pause of someone who had prepared measured language and was choosing between the measured version and the honest one. Comprehensive. Significantly more comprehensive than what we anticipated from a pilot proposal. It includes a 3-phase curriculum architecture, a conditions assessment rubric, a candidate selection framework for the environmental read component, and a comparative analysis of current program methodology against what she's calling situational immersion training. Walker said nothing. "She's proposing a parallel training track," Chen said. "Not a modification of existing curriculum. A second track that candidates would move through simultaneously with standard instruction designed to build the environmental read and multivariable response capabilities that current curriculum doesn't address." "That's larger than a pilot," Walker said. "Yes," Chen said. "It is." "She's 17 years old, and she's been in the program for 6 weeks. We're aware," the program director said from the end of the table. "We're also aware that the framework is technically sophisticated and practically grounded in ways that our own curriculum development teams haven't produced in recent review cycles." He paused. "We'd like your assessment of whether this is viable." Walker looked at the document on the table. At the 40 pages that a 17-year-old had produced in 6 weeks while simultaneously beginning the most demanding training track in the program. He thought about the legal pad in the bottom drawer. About the sentence he'd written at 02:30, on the night after the 1,200-meter shot, the love and the loss and the capability were all built together. I thought about a Wyoming hunting guide who had written, "She doesn't calculate the shot. She waits until she understands what it wants to be, and then she lets it be that." He thought about Robert Carter in Colorado in 1994, settling into position with the stillness of someone who had completely run out of resistance to the conditions around him and found in that surrender perfect clarity. "My assessment," Walker said, "is that we should implement it." Chen looked at him. "Full proposal, not the pilot. Full proposal, with appropriate oversight and evaluation benchmarks." He looked at the program director, and with the understanding that the person designing it may revise it significantly as she runs it in practice. Because she doesn't work from finished systems, she works from ongoing engagement with the real thing. The program director was quiet for a moment. Then, implement it. Chen looked at both of them. Then she made a note on her copy of the document, and the meeting moved forward, and somewhere in a Tier 1 training facility, 200 miles away. Avery Carter was on a range in the early morning, reading the wind. Before the day's instruction began, filling her 15th notebook with the documentation of a living process that was still becoming itself. She did not know yet what had just been decided. She was too busy doing the work to wait for the decisions to catch up. The final debrief between Walker and Mitchell happened informally 2 months after the evaluation closed. They were at the facility for a different program entirely, and they ended up at the same lunch table, which was not coincidental because neither of them believed in coincidence on operational matters, and Walker had specifically chosen the table. Mitchell had a notebook in his breast pocket. Government issue green. Avery's inscription visible on the inside cover when he opened it to check a note. Walker saw it, said nothing about it, filed it. She submitted a 40-page curriculum framework, Walker said. Mitchell looked at him. I heard. In 6 weeks. I heard. They're implementing the full proposal. Mitchell set down his fork. The full proposal, not the pilot. Full proposal, parallel track, program-wide. Mitchell sat with this for a moment. Then, her father gave her a 12-year education that we couldn't replicate in 30 years of institutional curriculum development. And now she's going to build the curriculum that gets us closer to what he built. That's accurate. 19 years from now, Mitchell said slowly, when this program has a generation of candidates coming through who can read atmospheric compression in real time and manage parallel communication threads under operational pressure and stay open under sustained uncertainty, instead of falling back on technical compensation, those candidates won't know her name. They'll just have the capability. Walker thought about this. They'll know her name, he said. I'll make sure of it. Mitchell looked at him. The documentation is on record, Walker said. The evaluation data, the recommendation, the curriculum proposal, all of it. Her name is on all of it. He paused. Robert Carter's name is in my notes. In the legal pad I keep in the bottom drawer. He paused again. Someday I'll put it in the official record too. Mitchell nodded. They were quiet for a moment. Then Mitchell said, You know what she said to me the morning she left, when I asked what she was going to do next? What? She said, Find out where my ceiling is. Mitchell picked his fork back up. Same thing she said to Hargrove in the meeting. Same thing she's been saying since she walked in the door. She hasn't found it yet, Walker said. No. Mitchell looked at him. I don't think she will. Walker thought about the 1,200-meter target standing clean and neutral in the California afternoon, carrying no visible record of what had happened in front of it. He thought about the wind at that distance, 2.5 seconds of flight time, a lifetime of variables between the muzzle and the impact point. Every one of them readable if you were patient enough and honest enough, and had been taught to listen by someone who loved you enough to spend 12 years teaching you how. She came in carrying a worn rifle case, Walker said, and her father's voice. She left with the same things, Mitchell said, plus a government contract and a 40-page curriculum proposal. And one veteran's field notebook. Mitchell touched the breast pocket. And one veteran's field notebook. They finished their lunch. The facility around them moved at its ordinary pace, the routine of a training program that was in 6 weeks going to look significantly different from how it had looked for the previous 30 years, because a 17-year-old girl had walked through its evaluation process with nothing to prove and everything to offer, and the profound, clear-eyed patience of someone who had been taught by the best teacher she would ever know that the shot is always the last decision you make. The first decision is understanding what the world is telling you. Avery Carter had walked into a room full of people who expected her to fail, and she had not proved them wrong. She had made that question irrelevant. She had simply done the work. Her father's work, her own work, the ongoing work of becoming the fullest version of what someone who loved her had seen in her long before she could see it in herself. And the work had answered. The work always answered. It was the only answer that was ever really hers to give, and she had given it completely, without performance, without defense, without the need for anyone's confirmation of what she already knew in the deepest, most unshakable part of herself. She was not a teenage girl who had surprised the Navy SEALs. She was a professional who had walked into the room she had spent her entire life preparing to enter, and she had performed at the level she had always been capable of, and the only thing that had ever been in question was whether the people in the room would have the honesty to see it clearly. They did, and that clarity changed them. And the change would carry forward into every evaluation. This program ran every candidate. It shaped every professional. It sent into the world, carrying capabilities they had learned from a curriculum built by a girl from Wyoming who read wind, the way other people breathed automatically, continuously, without effort, because it was not a skill anymore. It was who she was. It was who her father had made her. And that was permanent. That was real. That was the thing that outlasted every doubt and every distance, and every person who had looked at her and seen something too young or too female or too unconventional to be taken seriously. Avery Carter had taken herself seriously from the beginning. Everything else was